A Walk in My Skin by Zoe Lambreas. Chapter 1. A Migrant to Australia. Theodoros, being the eldest son, keenly felt the responsibility of supporting his widowed mother and 5 siblings. Ever since his 12th year, he had shouldered this burden when his father had drowned in the Messenian Gulf, trying to save his 2 grandchildren after the overladen boat they were travelling in had overturned. He was returning his grandchildren to their parents in Kalamata, where he had sent Theo and his youngest son, George, to help out in their sister's bakery. Kalamata was a safe haven from the civil unrest and roaming militia who captured country folk at random. After the accident, the body of Theo's father was never recovered. However, the corpses of the 2 children were lifted out of the sea and placed on a wooden horse-drawn cart for their final journey home to their parents. Theo was there when the cart arrived outside the bakery, and he shared the pain and anguish of his distraught sister and brother-in-law Stavros. The grief of Stavros was so intense that he suffered a breakdown and lost touch with reality. Sadly, Stavros never recovered and was institutionalized for the remainder of his life. It fell to his wife and older daughter to earn enough money in the bakery to pay for his care, and it fell upon Theo to seek means to nurture his mother and siblings. But then, ominously, the Second World War struck Europe. Seeking a viable future gave way to the need for survival in an impoverished Greece, devastated by the war, when German and Italian soldiers occupied Greece and destroyed the country's infrastructure. City dwellers like the Athenians had starved to death, while villagers were forced to surrender their livestock and produce to hungry, wandering enemy soldiers. Then, after World War II, the unthinkable happened when Greece became embroiled in a vicious civil war from 1946 to 1949, dividing friends, neighbours, and even brothers who struggled with right and left ideologies, backed on one side by the UK and the USA, and on the other by Albania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and the Soviet Union. This civil war was horrific, and many Greeks killed each other before the communist left was defeated by the Hellenic army. After these wars, Greece was ravaged and needed strong, skillful leadership, but the federal government had little power, and from 1949 to 1953 there were 9 different governing leaders, each holding tenure in office from several days to less than 2 years. Theo had survived as a prisoner during the Civil War, and now, in such politically restless days, desperately sought a way to help his family. Of course, he felt fortunate and blessed when he secured a job as a policeman in Athens. At that time, the youth of Athens were often seen wearing jumpers or jackets with one sleeve unworn and left dangling. For some reason it had become a fashion fad, or perhaps it was a political protest against the ruling government of the day. The Greek government responded by issuing policemen with scissors to snip off the sleeves left hanging loose and unworn. After all his struggles during the wars, Theo found this initiative somewhat amusing. It found a resonant chord with his humour. Another government determination was to enforce strict food and hygiene laws for cafes and restaurants to lift the standard of living. Therefore, much of the police work involved the inspection and strict implementation of these laws. Proprietors of food businesses were given only one warning by a white-gloved police officer who had detected any dust whatsoever on their premises. If dust was observed on a subsequent visit, the business had to be permanently shut down by the police. This was Theo's job, but he abhorred the draconian and excessive aspect of this part of his work. To put someone's livelihood in jeopardy by being the means of enforcing rigid and extreme government policies was beyond his sense of justice. Although his job was easy and well paid, Theo lived by the dictates of his conscience. If he was to be the instrument by which others were ruined thus unfairly, he would rather suffer himself. He quit his job. Now, what would he do? By this time, 1953, Theo was in his early 30s, 6 feet 4 inches tall, handsome and full of hope for the future. What could he turn his hand to? He had helped his 2 unmarried sisters by providing them with their own stone houses as part of their dowries, but now there remained the provision for his 2 younger brothers. He knew the olive groves they had inherited from their father could not sustain all 3 of them should they each marry and receive a 3rd portion. He was egalitarian towards his brothers and finally persuaded himself to take drastic measures. After much heart-searching, Theodoros decided to leave Greece for a chance at a better life overseas in Australia. His brothers would then be able to eke out a feasible living from their inheritance, splitting the family farmland in half rather than 3 ways. Like many others, Theo thought he would make lots of money and send some back to his beleaguered family in Greece. Of course, cash in envelopes is not secure, but this was a common practice. Indeed, for several years he posted cash to his brother Panayotis. Who knows if he actually received it? Thus it was that in October 1953 he boarded the ship Fair Star, bound for Melbourne. That year, Theo was one of approximately 75,000 new migrants who came with high hopes to settle in Australia. He emigrated with the support of the Australian government, for whom he worked for 2 years to repay his fare to Australia. Nothing for nothing, there is always a catch, so he was obliged to work at whatever the government determined in order to gradually repay his debt through a small deduction from his wages. That was the deal, known as the Assisted Passage Program, and migrants were brought over to build Australia's infrastructure. It was physically demanding and often back-breaking work. Theo was settled in Bonegilla, where migrants were given a couple of weeks of accommodation. It is located about 300 kilometres northeast of Melbourne. He indeed remained there for 2 weeks, learning basic English until he was allocated work, laying railway tracks in Victoria. When Theo first started this job, he worked hard because, being grateful, young and strong, he wanted to impress his new workmates. However, his crew of co-workers, who were all Aussies, told him to take it easy. "Just relax a little, matey," they told him. "There's no hurry. She'll be right." That was Theo's first experience of the enigmatic Australian culture of taking it easy and "she'll be right, mate." Theo soon learnt what it meant to have a tea break or when it was time for a smoko. Regardless of these work breaks, Theo's job was hard, physical and critical to the framework and facilities of a young Australia. His next job was to strip the bark off trees in Western Australia. Back then, Australia had a large tannin industry which depended on harvesting black wattle trees in the bush. The bark was used mainly by tanneries for tanning leather, but was also used for making ropes and nets. The leftover bark was called tan bark and was used as mulch or as a covering for paths. In fact, the tan, the 4-kilometre path around the Royal Botanic Gardens in Melbourne, received its name because it was originally spread with tan bark. When Theo's 2 years of government work was up, he returned to Melbourne. He was at his wits' end as to what to do. What would you do? As he had worked on building railway tracks, Theo decided to take a train to the end of the line, to a place he had become accustomed to whilst working in Victoria. The railway track ended at Hamilton in the Western District. Having been there during his work details, he had become familiar with this town, which was quite large, having a population of around 11,000. Hamilton is a rural community and was famous for its merino sheep farms. Australia's 22nd Prime Minister, Mr. Malcolm Fraser, had a farm there, Nareen. The town has 2 main streets of shops, in Grey Street and in Thompson Street. Theo disembarked the train and walked till he got to Thompson Street. While working alongside Aussies, Theo had learnt to drink a glass or 2 of beer rather than retsina, the Greek wine, which had been made for at least 2,000 years. When he spied a pub, the Commercial Hotel, he decided to go in for a beer. It felt good to be off the train and to sit in a cool place alongside other men, even though he didn't know anyone. It might interest you to know that in those days it was illegal for women to drink in a pub. It was men only. While he was drinking his schooner, he looked up and saw a man wink at him. Theo was immediately offended and became angry. He felt the blood rush to his face because in Greece men only winked at women. Theo didn't want anyone to have any wrong ideas about him, so feeling the insult very deeply, he jumped up, went over and angrily grabbed the man's collar. Wanting to defend his honour, he reached backwards with his free hand, making a fist, but it was grabbed from behind by a couple of blokes who fortunately sat nearby. They pulled Theo away and asked him why he wanted to fight. In his broken English, he explained that the man had winked at him and that it was an insult to his manhood. The other men explained that in Australia, a wink can sometimes mean "G'day" or "How you going, mate?" Theo felt humiliated, but was soon able to smile with the other men around about and shake hands with the unfortunate one who had winked at him. It had all been a cultural misunderstanding, but it became apparent to Theo that Australia had some very strange customs. As he left the pub, he heard a racial slur that had become familiar to his ears. "Bloody dago," and then the roar of laughter. His face crimsoned again. Theo left the pub, ashamed of himself and shaking his head in wonder. Australia certainly would take some getting used to. Even after 2 years, he still felt alienated. It is true that through ignorance we make mistakes, and by mistakes we can also learn. However, would he ever learn? Unfortunately, Theo thought he had heard "How you going, Mike?" following this incident, and for the rest of his life, Theo usually greeted people with a wink and "How you going, Mike?" rather than "mate." He wanted to be friendly and remembered his lesson well. As sometimes happens with learners of another language, Theo just had not differentiated between the 2 words. His future family never corrected him. They thought it was his own private joke.